Yeah, okay. Good evening, folks. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we have been doing as a research group over the last 14 or 15 years in the Eastern Himalayas in Arunachal Pradesh, and trying to understand how birds are responding to climate change as well as habitat degradation. Trying to understand how important temperature is as a determinant of birds' ranges, and if temperature ultimately turns out to be very, very important in determining where birds are found along a mountain. So low elevations are warm, higher elevations are cold. So if actually temperature turns out to be a very, very important determinant of where a species is found, then we can expect that climate change is going to make things, is going to cause things to differ in the future as temperatures become warmer and warmer. So, like I said, this is about 14 or 15 years worth of work. And of course, none of it would have been possible without funding from a bunch of places, most recently from the MOEFCC, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, as well as Science and Engineering Research Board. But a whole lot of people have been involved, a whole lot of agencies have been involved. And the Arunachal Pradesh Forest Department has been very supportive of the work that we've been doing in terms of permits and just generally institutional support. Since 2011, we've had the same crew in the field. They're absolutely brilliant, brilliant people. These five young men, not so young anymore, but amazing cooks, amazing company, amazing drivers, amazing field staff, very skilled. They can identify every single species of bird in that landscape from sound. Very good with mist nets, very good with rings, and just spectacular people. So huge shout out to these people for making this project possible. Okay, what we focus on as a research group is largely climate change and habitat loss. And we know that climate is changing. CO2 concentrations are the highest they've ever been in the last 100,000 years or so. And the Earth is becoming warmer and warmer. At the same time, species are not exposed to climate change alone. Species are exposed to both climate change and other threats. Hunting, for example, habitat loss. And so these threats are not operating alone. So we need to understand how climate change might be interacting with habitat loss to influence outcomes for populations. How these what are called global change drivers are they causing feedback effects? Does habitat loss complicate the effects of climate change? So asking questions like that. So broadly, what I'm going to talk about today is, in terms of climate change and ecological communities, is trying to understand how sensitive species are to temperature. And when I say species, I'm talking about bird species. How sensitive bird species are to temperature. And then trying to understand whether these species can survive in basically what is a warmer and more degraded world. Right? The Eastern Himalayas are warming very, very fast, and they're getting more and more degraded. So it's trying to understand how these species are going to be able to navigate this change in the environment. So let's just start off with looking at climate change and ecological communities. One of the things we were interested in is asking how sensitive are these species to temperature? How sensitive are birds to temperature? And every species has a range, and every species has range limits. There is a reason why the splendid fairy wren has not expanded its range beyond that blue polygon, right? There's something here that's preventing this species from expanding its range. And if you look at two very, very closely related species, the splendid and the superb fairy wren, where the splendid sort of ends is where the superb starts. And so the question you can ask is competition causing this? In that the splendid, the superb fairy wren is preventing the splendid from moving this way, expanding its range this way, whereas the splendid is preventing the superb from expanding its range eastwards. Is it competition? Or is it that the splendid fairy wren is just adapted to the environmental conditions that are found here, whereas the superb fairy wren is a more coastal adapted species? Or is it a combination of both? Asking questions about what exactly sets species ranges. And people have been talking about this, thinking about this for the last 150 years. Darwin, of course, everything ends up, Darwin, you trace any idea and Darwin has written about it. So Darwin, on the origin of species, in 1859, hypothesized that in the tropics, because there's many more species in the tropics, competition is going to be high. So competition will set range limits in the tropics. Whereas if you go to higher latitudes, if you go towards the poles, you're going into temperate areas, right? You're going into highly seasonal environments. So in those environments, it's seasonality or temperature that should limit species ranges. This is what Darwin suggested. Little more than 100 years later, Dan Jansen wrote a very, very influential paper. It's called Why Mountain Passes Are Higher in the Tropics. And Dan Jansen said, species in the tropics have evolved in locations that have low seasonality. And so they will be highly temperature sensitive. Whereas species that are at the poles, because they're adapted to deal with high seasonality, temperature should not be as important a determinant of species ranges at higher latitudes. So Dan Jansen is basically saying the opposite of what Darwin is saying. So we set out to test this. And in the Himalayan mountain range, the Himalayas are warming actually 3 times as fast as the global average. So they're becoming hotter very, very fast. And the Himalayas are exceptionally biodiverse. If you look at, this is a map of bird species richness, color-coded based on the number of species that are found in a certain location. You can see that the real hotspots are the Amazon and the Andes, the Eastern Arc Mountains of Africa, and then the Himalayas. And the Eastern Himalaya actually is the second most biodiverse location on Earth after the Amazon Andes altitudinal gradient. So we have about 600 breeding bird species in the Eastern Himalayas from low elevations to high elevations. So it's exceptionally species-rich area. And the thing about the Eastern Himalayas, about the Himalayas as a whole, is that they are very strong abiotic and biotic gradients. This is what Dan Jansen is saying, right? He's saying, this is what Darwin is saying. He's saying in the tropics there are more species, so competition should be important. Whereas there are lower species and there's more seasonality at higher latitudes, and therefore seasonality or temperature would be more important in determining species range. Very similar to that latitudinal diversity gradient where you have more species in the tropics and less species as you move away from the tropics. There's a gradient in the number of bird species in the Himalayas, where the Eastern Himalayas has about twice as many bird species as the Western Himalayas. So there are 2 locations that we studied. This is in the east in Arunachal Pradesh, in the west in Himachal Pradesh. And Himachal Pradesh has half the number of bird species that Arunachal has, but it is twice as seasonal in terms of temperatures. So annually, the amount of temperature variability that you see between summer and winter in Himachal Pradesh is twice as much as you see in Arunachal Pradesh. So Arunachal Pradesh is species rich and relatively aseasonal, whereas Himachal Pradesh is like the poles. It's species, fewer number of species, but far more seasonal. So this gives us a nice framework to test questions related to temperature and competition. So who's right? Is Darwin right or is Jansen right? And what we did was basically to go out into the field to these 2 locations, Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary and Great Himalayan National Park. These are separated by 1,500 kilometers east to west. And in each location, what we did was we set up transects. Transects spanning almost the entire elevational gradient. So in Eagle Nest, for example, in the Eastern Himalayas, we went from about 1,000 meters to 3,000 meters above sea level, so a 2,000 meter gradient in elevation. So just paths that are in the forest that were used for sampling. Yeah? So just walking along these transects in the forest and sampling birds. And on each transect, what we did while we were walking these transects was to put out temperature loggers. So these temperature loggers are out there collecting temperature data every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, they collect one temperature reading. So there are, for example, 5 of these eye buttons along that transit, right? And what this allows you to do is, if I see this bird on this date at this location.
You said about the Amazon rainforest and Himalayans are the second highest diversified. So Amazon is a completely rainy forest or evergreen forest, and Himalayan regions are likely the coldest regions. How can we can see the highest diversity in the Himalayan region?
Sorry, why are there more?
Why?
So like Amazon has high diversity, that makes sense because it's very tropical.
Yeah.
But why?
Eastern Himalayas are definitely more tropical. The bird species come from the tropics. They come from Southeast Asia. They come from China. And what happens with South China and what happens with, so they've immigrated into the
Because
Himalayan mountain range.
Himalayans have a very high altitudes compared to other regions. That makes sense when mountains have a.
No, but basically what happens is you have the lower elevations have lots and lots of
Okay.
mid elevations also. The species richness is not coming from that higher.
Okay, understood.
So what you've got on mountains is basically you're packing a lot of species into a much smaller area because species have different elevational ranges. So there'll be some species that will be found only from 50 meters to 1,000 meters. They'll not go above 1,000. Then there'll be another set of species that are found between 1,200 to 1,800 meters in elevation. So the elevational ranges of different species are different. And so you're packing into one location, you're packing a lot of species in mountains. So the idea behind putting out these loggers was, if I see this fire-tailed Myzornis on 20th of May, I can tell what the minimum and maximum temperature on that day was at that location by interpolating from the temperature loggers that are on either side of that sighting. Right? So for every sighting, I know what is the minimum temperature and the maximum temperature on that day. Yeah. Lot of birds, what they do, this is the same mountain slope in summer and in winter. You can see quite a stark difference in winter. It's snow covered. And a lot of birds in the Himalayas, what they do, unlike long distance migration, where birds will fly over long distances, a lot of birds basically do a short elevational migration. They breed higher up in summer, and then when it becomes cold in winter, they go down to lower elevations where it's cooler. So if this species was a perfect thermal specialist, let's say for the sake of argument, this species likes 20 degrees Celsius. It can't deal with 18, it can't deal with 22. It wants 20 degrees Celsius. In that case, this species should move to such an extent that it finds 20 in summer and 20 in winter. So perfect thermal specialist would move to track temperatures perfectly. Right? And we're asking to what degree do these species actually track temperatures? So this is what we did. Don't worry about the equation and all over there. But basically, you've got in summer a certain temperature space occupied by a species, and in winter, a certain temperature space occupied by a species.
Hi, so you spoke about the temperature loggers. So is this like air temperature, or you are keeping the loggers on the trees because trees
Air temperature?
Air temperature.
air temperature, so they are suspended in the air, like they're suspend.
No. That it's like at breast height. It's taped to a tree.
So one tree would radiate a different temperature compared to the air temperature.
So would like some of the birds are higher up in the canopy?
Canopy, yeah. I mean,
Would there be a difference in temperature?
yes, there is some variation in temperature as you go from low heights to the canopy, but we can't control for that.
No, I mean like for every surface would radiate heat in a
This is
particular.
all underneath the canopy. So pretty much the surface temperature is the air temperature at that height.
Okay, then it makes sense. Yeah.
And so for every species, what we get is some summer temperature space occupied. So this is minimum temperature, maximum temperature. Some space in summer some space in winter, and we can ask what is the overlap between summer and winter temperature space used relative to the overall temperature space that's available in summer versus winter. Because you might not even get the same kinds of temperatures in summer and winter. So correcting for that, we're asking what is the amount of overlap. So perfect thermal specialist would have summer and winter spaces overlapping perfectly, right? And then we're asking questions like, if you look at body mass on the x-axis, and that's on a log scale, and you look at that temperature overlap, the overlap in the niche of, in the temperatures between summer and winter, and we expect, larger species are better thermoregulators. Yeah? So larger species would be less susceptible to changes in temperature than smaller species. Smaller species are poorer than larger species in terms of regulating temperature. So you would expect that smaller species would have high overlap between summer and winter, and larger species would have low overlap between summer and winter. What you see is this, both in the Eastern Himalayas and the Western Himalayas. So this is the Eastern pattern for the Eastern Himalayas, and this is the pattern for the Western Himalayas. But the pattern is twice as strong in the East than it is in the West. So the steep in the East than it is in the West, indicating that these smaller species in the Eastern Himalayas are thermally sensitive compared with the same size species in the Western Himalayas. And as when you become bigger than a certain size, then your sensitivity to temperature is, the effect of East versus West disappears. Right? So, in fact, it's in the relatively aseasonal Eastern Himalayas that bird species seem to be more thermally sensitive than in the highly seasonal Western Himalayas. If you look at populations of the same species that are found in the East and the West, so there are many species that are found in the Eastern Himalayas and the Western Himalayas. The Western Himalayas, on the whole, are sort of a subset. The bird assemblage in the Western Himalayas is a subset of the assemblage in the East. Yeah. So you lose species as you move towards the West. But there are 10 species that we were able to sample that are found in the Eastern Himalayas and the Western Himalayas. And if you look at the thermal index overlap, the sensitivity index overlap for populations of the same species in the East and the West, Eastern populations of the same species are more thermally sensitive than, oops. Oh, that's gone all the way back. Okay, hang on. Yeah. So chestnut-headed tisia, which is that bird there, the sensitivity in the East is far more than the sensitivity in the West. And that's pretty much true for all these species, where the Eastern populations of the same species are more temperature sensitive than the Western populations of the same species. So we tend to think of species as sort of homogeneous units, right? That this species is going to respond to climate change like this. But it turns out it's quite possible that chestnut-headed tisia or green-backed tit or striated laughing thrush, the way that Eastern Himalayan populations might respond to climate change might be very different from the way Western Himalayan populations might respond to climate change. Western Himalayan populations might be, I'm already adapted to so much seasonality. 1 degree is not causing me too much distress. Whereas the Eastern Himalayan population would be like, boss, what's going on? I need to. So Eastern population, so it's in the aseasonal habitat where you tend to find thermally sensitive populations.
Be accessibility, as in the Western Himalayas are more rugged, and Western Himalayas are more rugged, and the Eastern Himalayas are less rugged. So the Western Himalayan birds cannot really go from a very high altitude point to a very low altitude point. That might not be the case.
Ability to migrate altitudinally
Yeah.
might be different between the East and the West, allowing for
Generally, well, that might be true. And that might be what is giving rise to these patterns as well. But the takeaway is that in the East, regardless of what might be causing those differences in patterns. In the east, there is more overlap in summer and winter thermal spaces than in the west.
All right.
Okay, so in terms of climate and communities, the takeaway is basically that in the relatively aseasonal eastern Himalayas are where populations seem to be thermally constrained. And it's in the eastern Himalayas that it's likely that climate impacts will be much, much stronger on species than in the western Himalayas. So that is something to worry about because a lot of species are found in the eastern Himalayas. Not just birds, but pretty much any taxonomic group.
Yeah, sorry to go back on that same point. So what is your thought on why this is happening, the two populations being different?
I think they just adapted to different levels of seasonality.
Why?
Why?
Sorry, how?
How?
How and all, I don't know. You mean like the genetic basis of things, or like?
I just curious. I mean, behavioral, genetic. I mean, I don't know what are they doing. Is there any difference in general that, like, it's the same species? So
I think that's something we need to look at.
How diverged are those populations?
Yeah.
Right? You're talking about adaptation.
Yes.
Takes some time. I don't know. That would be really
It
interesting.
would be interesting to see, because this is a relatively recent colonization as well onto the Himalayas. And so it's likely that seasonality itself is imposing a filter, where you've got species that can deal with seasonality that are able to reach the west. And then over time, what happens is they then adapt to local conditions. But how that's happening?
Can I just ask? Yeah, so I was just interested in one particular species, that yellow-bellied fantail, that has the highest between the two regions. I mean, did you all look into why that had
That difference?
Yeah, among
Is the highest. Yeah, it's also a very small bird. It's probably the smallest bird on this list, or maybe not. Maybe the black-tailed bush-tit is.
So is there a clue in the fact that, I mean, this effect is more pronounced in small birds,
It is more pronounced in small
but
birds.
these are endotherms.
Hmm?
So is smallness then more affecting altitudinal migration, some movement type thing? And so it's to do with movement. Like suppose you somehow normalized by species,
Right.
but some other trait
Right.
associated with movement.
Actually, we have very, very small species that are residents, and very, very large species that also move. So some of these birds, that are resident, they're like 8 grams. And you're wondering, it's an 8-gram bird, and how is it managing to deal with such a brutal winter? Because it's at 3,300 meters above sea level, and it does not come down. So yeah, anyway, that's something. Okay, now this is what our long-term data is trying to answer, which is how are these populations going to survive in basically what's going to be an environment that is warm and an environment that is more degraded. It's right now. This is a form of degradation, habitat degradation, called selective logging. On the right, what you see is undisturbed forest. As you can see, the canopy is closed. You see, there are no trails, there's no openings in the... And then on the left is selectively logged forest. And selective logging is this process by which some subset of the trees, the entire forest is not cleared, but some subset of trees are removed from the forest. And that subset is removed because it's commercially, either the species is commercially important or the individual is large enough to make logging profitable. So what you're seeing is a change in the structure of the forest, right? You're seeing a more open canopy. It's far more sunlight coming down into the canopy, coming down into the habitat, and that changes a whole lot of characteristics of forests. So what's on the left here is average temperature in degrees Celsius across an 24-hour time period. Right? And the green is primary forest, the brown is logged forest. And you can see that at the peak at about 1 p.m., logged forest is about 1.5 degrees hotter than primary forest. And logged forest is actually cooler at night because the canopy is open and the heat just leaves that. So log forest becomes more variable in terms of temperature than primary forest. Although the average difference in temperatures is about 2 Celsius, 2 Celsius itself is a big jump in temperatures between primary and log forest. So populations of the same species in log forest are facing a very different environment from populations of species in primary forest. That's average temperatures, but maximum temperatures in log forest are 6 degrees hotter than temperatures in primary forest. That is a massive, massive jump. And you can imagine, not only is climate change causing things to become warm, habitat degradation is complicating that. It's adding even more warmth to an already hot system. Primary forest is also about 20% more humid. So this is moisture than log forest consistently throughout the day. So logged forest becomes drier and hotter. And if the environment is changing to that degree, you would expect that that would have impacts on ecological communities, right? And what we looked at was, what are these birds eating, right? And how does the composition of arthropod communities change between primary and log forests? So this is something called an NMDS. Don't worry about what it is, but it's basically a visualization showing each of these dots is a sample of the arthropod community in primary forest and in brown in log forest. What you're seeing is that the composition of arthropod communities in primary forest is very different from the composition of arthropod communities in log forest. The things that these birds are eating, which are hemipterans, arachnids, spiders. Hemipterans are bugs, arachnids are spiders, lepidopterans are butterflies and moths. So a lot of these birds are feeding on the larval stages of these orders. Those are more common in primary forest. They become rarer in log forest and they're replaced by all sorts of other things. So flies become more common in log forest. But a lot of the stuff that these birds are eating is actually declining with logging. So the abiotic environment has changed. Physiologically, these populations have to do something to deal with this abiotic environment. Not only has the abiotic environment changed, their food has also gone. All right, so these birds you would expect these birds in logged forest to have strong responses to logging. So this work is being done at Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. Yes.
So Umesh, how were the arthropod sampled?
So arthropods are sampled. What we did was we used 3 methods to sample arthropods. One of them is to place what's called a pitfall trap. So it's just like a ball that's placed level with the ground, and insects fall into the ball, and then we identify them based on to the order level. That's sampling terrestrial insects that are walking around on the ground. Insects that are in foliage, in leaves, you basically place a big funnel cloth funnel over the thing, and you beat it 10 times, and it's just standardized thing, and then you get at what's in the foliage. And arthropods that are in flight, flies and stuff, that we use a sticky trap. So just put up a sticky trap and these flies get. So this work is from Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary and has been running since 2011. And this is our 14th year of sampling these bird populations in primary and log forest in Eagle Nest. Eagle Nest is in West Kameng district of Arunachal Pradesh, and it was the only road that went up to to Tawang, which went up to the border with China. Until quite recently, this was the only road. So it's a militarily very, very important road. This is the road on which the Dalai Lama fled in 1959 along this. And so there's a place called Lama Camp in Eagle Nest. That's where the Dalai Lama stayed overnight when he fled Tibet during the Chinese crackdown. And because this was so militarily important, that road needed to be maintained. And to maintain the road, you have to melt tar, right? To put tar on the road. So the logging is actually happening to provide fuel to melt tar to maintain this road. That's why there was selective logging in this area. Fascinating place, amazing history. If you get a chance, do visit. So in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, what you're seeing is at 2000, this is at 2000 meters above sea level in what's called cloud forest. Cloud forest because actually the transpiration from the trees, it's cloudy, foggy a large part of the year. At 2000 meters, you have what's called wet temperate forest. Now, on the left is primary forest. This has never been logged, right? And you've got about 200 trees per hectare in primary forest. Yeah, canopy is relatively closed, hardly any understory because there's no sunlight reaching the ground, or very little sunlight reaching the ground. And on the right is logged forest, selectively logged, where the tree density has come down to about 75 trees per hectare. So more than a 2.5 time reduction in tree density with logging. And you see the canopy is opened up, a lot of sunlight coming in. Instead of having a fern understory with ferns here in primary forest, the understory becomes dominated by bamboo in logged forest. And in these forest patches, what we've got are 3 primary forest patches outlined in green and 3 logged forest patches outlined in red. And they range in size. So the total area that we're sampling here is about 9 hectares in primary forest and 9 hectares in logged forest across these 3 plots. Yeah, and each of those, these dots is the location of a mist net. I'll tell you what a mist net is. And so we run a total of 185 mist nets every year. So we go out into a plot, put out mist nets in exactly the same locations, run those nets for 3 days, move to the next plot. So 18 total days of mist netting every year from 2011. And this is a mist net. It's a vertical net. It's 12 meters long. It's 2.5 meters high. And it's got these shelves or pouches here. So against a background of vegetation, a mist net is pretty much invisible. And I have walked into my own nets many times, even though I know where my nets are. And so birds don't see this, right? And they fly into the net and they fall into these pouches. So we take the bird out, measure a whole bunch of things about it, body weight, wing length, whatever, blah, blah. And then we put on each of these birds a numbered aluminum ring, like a bangle. So it's a ring that does not harm the bird. It can move freely. It's not clamped to the leg. And every individual now has a unique identity, right? Because it's ringed with a certain ring number. If these birds were identifiable to the individual level, just to the naked eye, we would not need to do this. So for tigers, for example, you don't need to catch them and put a ring, right? Because the stripe pattern is unique for each tiger. But because we can't distinguish individual birds and we need to give them an individual identity, this is sort of like standard mist netting, bird ringing kind of procedure that's done across the world. So we ring these birds and then we let them go. That's a Sikkim wedge-billed babbler, fascinating species. Nobody knew anything about it until maybe 2004, 2006. It's only known from museum specimens and it was known from 1 or 2 locations in Bhutan. Turns out it's not a very uncommon species, very distinctive song, and likes to hang out near streams. But anyway, so that's a ringed bird that has been released back into the wild, and this photograph was taken by a tourist visiting Eagle Nest, and then he sent it to me. He said, "Hey, I got one of your ringed birds." And so when we put out these mist nets year after year, we get either new captures, birds that have never been caught or ringed before, or we get recaptures, birds that have been ringed before. So that's an example of a recapture. That's a rufous-winged falweta that's been caught in a net and it has been ringed in the past. Yeah, it could be 1 year before, it could be 8 years before. And some of the things we're finding out about these birds is quite fascinating, because you've got tiny birds, 6 grams, 8 grams, that live for 8 years. So how are these birds so long-lived? Because they're tiny. You'd expect lifespans to be on the order of 2 or 3 years, but actually some of them turn out to be quite long-lived. And so we do this, and stunning biodiversity. And remember, we're not catching anything that flies up in the canopy, right? We're only catching stuff that's in the understory. See, we've got about 10,500 captures of almost 7,000 individual birds. So we've ringed 7,000 individual birds and about 135 species. And you can see amazing variation in what these species are like. I mean, who comes up with something like this? It's like that's a long-tailed broadbill. It looks like it's wearing a helmet and it's got two patches on the, bizarre. Just to give you a few names, that's a slender-billed scimitar babbler, that's a coral-billed scimitar babbler. This is so these are residents, they don't move. They're not elevational migrants. That is a verditor flycatcher, which is a long-distance migrant. It actually winters in South India. And it comes back every year to that ring bird will come to exactly the same tree year after year after year. In fact, Ashwin was saying that one of the birds that they ringed in the Western Ghats was seen in eagle nest because it spends its winter in the Western Ghats and it comes to the Himalayas to breed. That's a large-billed leaf warbler. Hey, what is the probability of that, right? Of all the large-billed leaf warblers, the one that came from eagle nest was the one that was ringed in the Western Ghats. That's a mountain tailor bird, long-billed wren babbler. That's a green magpie, white-crested laughing thrush. That's a pitta. This is a critically endangered bird called the Bugun leochicla.
Hi.
The known population of this bird is not more than 20 individuals. That's fewer individuals than there are people in this room. The global range of this species is 2 square kilometers. So it's really, really hyper-local, critically endangered species. It's named after the Bugun community on whose lands it was from. Yes.
How far this study site is from human habitation?
Yes, there's no human habitation.
There's no human habitation, okay.
There's no ongoing disturbance. The disturbance has been in the past. But what happens with the disturbance is that once you've got bamboo coming in the understory, that pretty much prevents any native tree species from regenerating. Any saplings get shaded out.
Okay.
And so the structure of the forest has remained the same for the last 15 years.
Right. So is there any disease endemic to this particular...
Sorry?
Is there any disease endemic to this particular space?
Any disease?
Disease, yeah.
We're starting to see a lot more avian pox,
Okay.
which was not there earlier. Like I was saying in the morning, this is 2,000 meters above sea level. It's quite cool. And there were no mosquitoes when we started doing field work. Now there are mosquitoes.
Yeah.
And so some mosquito-borne diseases, we're starting to see birds that we catch that have the, I think it's called the cutaneous form of avian pox, which is basically the eyes and stuff get covered with this tissue. And yeah, that's what we're seeing, but we don't know.
If there is no human invasion there, it may be the reason that disease caused by that avian pox to decrease in that species. To make,
What's up?
if there is no human invasion in that particular region where you collected the sample. Yes. Yeah. So the disease may be the reason to decline of that species. Climate change.
Mosquitoes are moving up.
Okay.
Because the conditions are becoming warmer and warmer and more and more suitable every year for mosquitoes at higher and higher elevations. This is something that's happened in places like Hawaii. A lot of the native Hawaiian birds have gone extinct because of malaria. And slowly, so earlier it was the low elevation species that went extinct because mosquitoes were found at low elevations. Now the mosquitoes are moving up into higher and higher elevations because of climate change and bringing with them various diseases that they so amazing biodiversity in Arunachal Pradesh. So what we get from capturing these birds is what's called a capture history. Varun and Divya were talking about occupancy. Very, very similar sort of process where we have, let's say there's a bird that's ringed with A259312. That's the ring number. Caught in year 1, not caught in year 2, caught again in year 3, caught again in year 4, never caught again. So you get 10110000. And the process that generates that capture history is the probability of getting captured and the probability of surviving from one year to the other. So jointly put together, you can actually estimate the probability of surviving bird. So if the probability of a bird surviving from one year to the next is 0.6, then 60% of the population will survive, 40% of the population will die over that 1 year time period. Yeah. So, like said, remember this is at 2,000 meters, and primary forest, logged forest, and at 2,000 meters, you've got some species like this white-tailed robin, where we are sampling close to the cold edge of the range of the species. If this is the range, elevational range of the species, that's a mountain. If this is the elevational range of a species from 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters, this is the warm edge of its range, right? At the lower elevation, this is the cold edge of its range. So we're sampling close to the cold edge for some species. For other species, we're sampling close to the warm edge, because the lower limit of the elevational range is close to 2,000 meters. Yes? Now with climate change, what's happening is that species are moving up, moving to higher elevations. This is not migration. These are range shifts. The entire range of the species shifts to a new elevational band. Right? Commonly, people will call this migration. And migration is an annual movement of an organism from one location to another and then back to the same location. This is a permanent shift in ranges of these species. So, so I'm just going to talk about survival trends over time for some 15 species. Now, with range shifts, this bird is going to move up towards 2,000 meters. That means 2,000 meters is getting more and more better and better for it over time because of change in climate, right? So survival rates of this species at this elevation should increase over time. Whereas this species is moving away from 2,000 meters, it's going even higher up. And so it's leaving 2,000 meters. 2,000 meters is getting worse and worse for it. So that species should show survival declines over time. What do we see with survival? This is time on the x-axis, that is survival rate on the y-axis, so that ranges between 0 and 1. Yeah. In this relatively short time period that we have been sampling, you're seeing some species showing drastic survival declines. So that species, the snowy-browed flycatcher, I started this work when I was doing my PhD. And the snowy-browed flycatcher was sort of like a safe species for me because there were so many individuals that I could actually model survival rates of snowy-browed flycatcher. So it's like, okay, one thesis chapter is there because of this species. This species has all but disappeared now, just in this 14-year time period. It's become extremely rare. The population has completely collapsed. So where in the beginning it had a survival rate of about 80%, annual survival rate of about 80%, that survival rate has come down to 20%. And this is in primary forest. So you're seeing some species showing drastic survival declines. Other species are not showing changes in survival. Some species actually showing survival increases. Yeah? So white-tailed robin, when we started working, was not present at 2,000 meters. It was simply not found at that altitude. Today, it's become one of the most common species that we're seeing here. And so its survival rates have actually gone from 0, because it was just not there in 2011, gone up to about 60% at that elevation. So this is in primary forest. And remember what we're saying. We're saying we are sampling at 2,000 meters. Species that are to the left, that have their elevational range below 2,000 meters are low elevation species. Species that have their ranges to the right, above, mostly above 2,000 meters, are higher elevation species. So if you divide this up, you've got your low elevation species here. They should be showing survival increases. So the y-axis is the slope of survival on time, right? So you got some slope, time, and survival. Survival is commonly denoted by phi. So if this slope is positive, then survival rates are going up over time, right? So that low elevation species that are moving up towards 2,000 meters, survival rate should be positive. Slope of survival on time should be positive. Survival rate should be going up, right? Whereas higher elevation species that are leaving 2,000 meters should be in this thing here, because their survival rate should be declining over time. Yeah, is this making sense? So basically we're saying we expect a cluster of points here, we expect a cluster of points here, and some relationship between elevational range of a species and how its survival is changing with time. And in primary forests, we see that. We see that the low elevation species are showing increases in survival rates over time, and the high elevation species are showing declines in survival rate over time. But you don't see that in logged forest. In logged forest, there is hardly any relationship between elevational range and survival trends. For a long time, we were thinking, what's going on here? You know, you expect this relationship to be even stronger in logged forest. You expect that because habitat is getting degraded, survival rate should be even more highly affected than primary forest. But that turns out that's not the case, and we thought about it a lot. And one of the students from our group actually went and did this. He went and for every capture, for every bird that was captured, every mist net was then a logger, temperature logger was put along with every mist net. So every time a bird was captured, we knew what temperature that bird was at, right? What temperature that bird was captured. So based on the temperature and humidity, so the logger measures temperature and it measures humidity. Based on the temperature and humidity, you can construct a sort of temperature humidity niche for a species in primary forest and a temperature humidity niche for a species in log forest. So you can see that primary forest is far more humid than log forest. This same individual yellow-throated fulveta is found in much more humid conditions in primary forest than it is in log forest. So the niche overlap between primary and log forest is low. Yeah, there are other species for which niche overlap between primary and log forest is high. Maybe they're doing something behaviorally. So maybe, you know, because log forest is hotter, maybe they're foraging at different times of the day. And they're able to match the conditions that their counterparts are in primary forest. So niche overlaps between, for those species are high. And what you see that in log forest, it's the niche overlap that determines survival trends. So if your niche overlap is high, you're able to find similar conditions to primary forest, then survival rates are pretty much not changing. The slope is only 0.1, it's not changing. Whereas if your niche overlaps are low between primary and log forest, if you're unable to find the kind of microhabitats that are apparently the best, most suitable to you in primary forest, their survival rates are actually declining. So it might be whether a population is able to find the kind of conditions that it is adapted to in primary forest. Can it find those conditions in log forest by changing, let's say, behavior, changing time of foraging? And if it's able to do that, it looks like survival rates are not as hit hard as species that have very little niche overlap between primary and log forest. So there seem to be niche differences between primary and log forest. Logging, some of the other results we have seem to be that logging selects for climatically adaptable species. And the joint effects of climate change and habitat degradation are actually combining to cause a lot of damage to these populations. So even though you have populations of the same species in log forest, it's possible that those individuals are extra individuals that are being kicked out of primary forest and ending up in log forest. In fact, we find that log forest individuals tend to be much lighter than primary forest individuals. It seems as if the primary forest individuals are in better body condition than log forest individuals, and that's understandable because the abiotic environment and the prey base is being affected by logging. So the takeaway, to my mind, in terms of conservation planning, in terms of conservation action, is that primary forest is necessary at all elevations. Now, climate change is going to happen whether we like it or not. This is not a problem that is going to be remedied by any one country or any one. You know, this requires global cooperation, which has been non-existent pretty much. You know. And we're in deep trouble with climate change. You know, whatever we do, it seems like it's not enough. You know, 2 years back, people said, let's shift shipping to clean oil, to cleaner oil that pollutes less. One of the reasons why we think this year's heat waves were particularly bad was one, it's following an El Nino year, so it's expected that summers will be harsher following an El Nino year. But the transition of shipping, global shipping, from dirty fuel to clean fuel, reduce the amount of aerosol in the air. Aerosols were reflecting sunlight back into the. And now with no reduced number of aerosols, even though that's a good thing for pollution, it's far worse in terms of climate impacts. And so this is something called aerosol termination shock. It's thought to be one of the contributing factors for why last year and this year have been particularly harsh summers. So we're in huge trouble with climate change. And if climate change happens, birds will shift their ranges to higher elevations, right? And so we want to have forest at all elevations so that species can actually shift their ranges into primary forest and not hit something like this, degraded. Now, this is an interesting thing because we often think of mountains as cones, right? And you've got lots of area at the low elevations. And as you move up, the amount of area comes down. That's not true of the Himalayas. If you've gone to the Himalayas, you will notice. I mean, the next time you go, you'll notice that you start taking steep hairpin bends when you're starting to climb. Once you reach a certain elevation, say 1800 meters, the hairpin bends disappear, and it becomes much flatter. And then once you cross about 2,400 meters, the hairpin bends are back. So the Himalayas are doing this, becoming shallower, and then going higher up again. So what happens between 1,800 and 2,400 meters is where the villages are. That's where the settlements are, that's where the agriculture is. It's in the mid elevations. You won't find villages and agriculture in the steep lower parts of the elevational range and the steep upper parts of the elevation. It's in that mid elevation band where most of settlement is concentrated. So you can imagine if you're a bird living here and you want to get there and you hit a ring of settlement and logging and agriculture, chances are that population is not going to make it. So what we need is primary forest at all elevations from the conservation point of view. Yeah, that was when I had more hair and less body mass. But it's been very rewarding to actually put the results of our work into action. And we have been working with the Bugun community that, all this eagle nest area, this is the Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. This area here is land that is owned and managed by the Bugun tribe. So the village council makes all decisions related to management of this. It's not coming from the top, it's not coming from the forest department. So if the village council is convinced that something needs to be done and something can be done, it gets done. You don't have to go through the forest department, and it's all very decentralized decision making. So actually, we've been working with the Bugun community since 2013, telling them about our results, telling them what we're finding, and that we need to preserve habitats from low elevations right to the top. And in 2017, actually, the Bugun community declared 17 square kilometers as a community reserve to protect biodiversity, primarily to protect the Bugun leochicler, that critically endangered bird I was telling you about. That's found around there. And then this year, added another 15 square kilometers to that protected area. So now 32 square kilometers of land is protected, and that goes from 1,300 meters to 3,300 meters in elevation. So you've got a 2,000 meter gradient in elevation that is currently being preserved. So this is that bird, the Bugun leochicler. It's actually got a ring on it. If you look there, that's one of our ringed individuals. And that's Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. That's where we are doing our long-term work. But this area is traditional lands of Singchung village of the Bugun community. And right now, this shaded bit is 17 square kilometers, and this additional is 15 square kilometers. And that goes from about 1,300 meters to 3,300 meters in elevation. So this is the kind of work that we've been doing, trying to understand how climate change and habitat degradation are coming together to impact species, and can we do something about mitigating those impacts in the future. So thank you. Question.
Hi, Umesh. Thank you for such a nice talk.
Thank you.
So my doubt is regarding the range shift. So it's a silly question. So are the beds able to adapt to that range shift? So not only the temperature, if the temperature also shifts to a particular altitude, the food, the availability also changes. and also the pressure also plays another factor. So how was the behavioral changes that has been seen in the bed? Any
These are
feeding?
all questions that are probably in somebody's mind right now and have not yet been operationalized in terms of research. There is a lot that is uncertain with climate change. In fact, for some species, especially ectotherms, especially those species that are stream dwelling and they have their larvae in streams, because of changes in temperature and changes in oxygen solubility in these streams, because the warmer it becomes, the less soluble oxygen is in water. Cold waters are oxygen rich, warm waters are oxygen poor. And then changing temperatures then changes solubility of oxygen. It changes also the membranes, the permeability of membranes through which these organisms are exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide with the water. So in those cases, actually, climate change predicts, and this has been shown, that the shifts will be downslope rather than upslope. There are other things, right? So like you say, pressure changes. That nothing, we can't do anything about that, right? The pressure is going to remain.
Yeah, so the decline, because of as the altitude range shift happens, the decline will also happen of the birds. So pressure can also be, because there won't be any change in the pressure. If the temperature also shifts, the pressure remains the same. So one attribute for the decline of the bird population can be the pressure. Can we say like
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are other unknowns. For example, plants might not be able to move as fast as animals can, right? And if you've got a symbiotic relationship between a moth and a plant, for example, and the plants are not moving up, but the moths are feeling the heat. The moths can move up, but the plants not keeping pace with it. So there's all sorts of other issues with climate change and rain shifts that, especially on mountains, might prove to be insoluble problems. Whereas if you've got latitudinal range shifts, and this is sort of well established by now, that species are shifting their ranges, both in flat areas they're moving towards the poles, and in mountains they're moving towards the top. So latitudinal range shifts will not be accompanied by changes in pressure.
Now, this altitudinal shift, it can only happen in a certain environment. Can it change from one Himalayan region to another? Can it happen? Only in one section it will happen. As different portions.
Another range.
And the range, yeah.
Other range?
Another range. Like you just talking about moving up the mountain, but maybe an adjacent mountain.
Yeah, if it gets a suitable.
Yeah, the patterns are different for different species. When I say upslope range shifts, I'm sort of lumping all those patterns into one box. There are some species that are expanding only the cold edge of their ranges. There are other species that the cold edge and the warm edge are moving up. So it varies from species to species based on, but here in the Himalayas, eastern Himalayas at least, it seems to be the warm edge and the cold edge that are both moving upwards.
Yeah.
So the birds in the logged forest have a higher survival rate as of now.
The forest cover?
Logged forest.
Logged, it's stable.
No.
No.
The rate of change of survival is different in log forest versus primary forest. It differs from species to species. So what happens is, if you've got low elevation populations in log forest, and low elevation populations are actually used to warmer temperatures, they might have higher survival in log forest than in primary forest. But generally, what's happening is that primary forest in general has higher survival rates across species than log forest does. And log forest also has poorer quality individuals in terms of, one of the things we're finding with climate change is that the wing length to body mass ratios are changing. Because one of the most effective ways for birds to lose heat is through the vasculature of their wings. So compared to, because feathers are excellent insulators, so compared to body size, wing lengths are increasing over time. So, and that's a signal we're seeing between primary and log forest also. Same population of birds in log forest have proportionately longer wings than birds in primary forest.
Can I ask a question? So suppose you put, talking about these different drivers, like let's call it ancestral niche, some kind of where you're from. Like, are you from lower elevation? So you're probably potentially more adapted to warmer environments. Then you have dispersal ability, and then you have body size. So if you were to use all of these to make predictions about survival or rates of change of survival, can you link them? I mean, can you predict? You're saying that it seems like this, it seems like that, but I'm asking whether can you actually make that prediction?
So, so I think there are three ways in which species are responding to climate change. If you've got decent dispersal ability, then ranges can shift. If you don't have good dispersal ability, then either behaviorally you adapt to changes in the environment, or you adapt physically through physical adaptations. So I would imagine that the small species would be.
No, I agree. These are generalizations, right? I'm saying in your community, given your species assemblage, can you predict and do the predictions match those general predictions, or are there some deviations?
There's something or the other that bucks the trend. And actually, there are people in the lab who are interested in understanding that. They're actually looking at the gut microbiomes to figure out stress levels, and feather corticosterone to figure out stress levels in primary and log forests over time. And they're going to look at whether corticosterone itself being secreted, if it's higher in log forests, does that stress hormone itself allow a species to overcome the abiotic challenges that the altered habitat faces? So,
I'm just curious to know, once you trap a bird, so what are the data you record, like morphometry, of course, and any other taxonomic data you record? And once that is done, are you, I mean, where all the birds were released to the
all the birds.
where the birds released to the,
Are they released? Like what's
yes.
processing? Basically, like 2 minutes per bird or less?
They're released immediately after processing. Processing
From
takes us maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes.
right? So what are the parameters you record when you trap?
What do we measure?
Yeah.
The first thing we measure is body mass.
Okay.
So these birds come in cloth bags, little cloth bags. They're taken out of the net, put in a cloth bag, and brought to the center of the plot where the processing station is. And so we first measure the bird with the bag. Then we take the bird out and we measure the empty bag, and we get the body size of the bird. We measure wing length. We measure the length of what's called the tarsus, which is the leg of the bird. What else do we measure? We sometimes put colored rings on one leg and a numbered ring on the other leg, and unique combinations for each individual. So we don't have to recapture the individual to tell what it is. And apart from that, we might collect a fecal sample and blood and a fecal sample. We don't collect blood for everything, but fecal samples, yes. And that's to figure out what these birds are eating through DNA metabarcoding, and also the bacterial communities or the gut microbiomes in these birds, which gives you an idea of overall health, because the gut microbiome is important for things like immunity. It's important for things like assimilating nutrients. And so we're looking to see whether the gut microbiome is actually shifting in its composition when there's some kind of disturbance like logging happening. That's pretty much what we're researching.
So has it been released from the exact location they have captured?
No, they're released about, so the plots are not very large. Each plot is about 3 hectares. And the processing station is the center of the plot. So depending on whether the bird was caught at a net close to the processing center or not, but these birds are amazing. They will go back to exactly the same location where they were found before. And some of these birds become what are called trap happy. And they'll keep getting into the same mist net over and over again. And that not only on that day, but year after year, the same individual will be found in exactly the same location. Even long distance migrants. I was just telling Uma before we came in, there's this species called the large blue flycatcher. And it goes to Southeast Asia in winter. And every year we've ringed that individual with a red ring. And every year it comes back to exactly the same bamboo perch. It's been doing that for the last 4 years. And every year the tourists come and tell me, we saw your red-ringed large blue flycatcher in that bamboo patch. So they're very, very, site fidelity is very high.
So
we were like we are discussing about the parameters like you were recording in the field. So there is like you had a chance of recording body temperature of the individual bird.
Sorry, I'm going to have to ask Umar to repeat.
Body temperature.
Huh.
Have you ever measured body temperature?
We tried to do that by taking thermal images.
Yeah.
With Anusha? Not yet.
Not yet, no. We tried to do that earlier. Getting body temperatures. So the ring around the eye is the patch of bare skin from which you can actually tell body temperature. Because the feathers insulate birds so well that the temperature on the surface is pretty much the temperature of the air. So we've been taking thermal images, but the problem is we've captured these birds, right? So very often these temporary stressful events, I think ringing a bird is like going to the dentist. You know, you go, you get a tooth removed or something, and then, you know, in a couple of days you forget about it. And the birds probably forget even sooner, right? But the thing about stress with birds, what happens is when a bird is stressed or any organism is stressed, a lot of blood goes to the core. Goes to the core organs, goes to, you know, the liver, the heart, and so what you see is a reduction in surface temperature because the blood's all gone into this. So even the thermal imaging is not good enough for us to tell what the body temperatures are. I know people who have actually measured temperatures, but by putting birds in chambers and then using a thermal camera to then look at the eye ring to see how temperatures are changing.
So what about the work that, for example, Anusha is starting? She's going to be doing thermal imaging of birds, but looking at things like torpor and like basically shutdown. Yeah. So I was curious about the pox. You talked about the pox. You know, isn't it? You said avian pox, right?
The pox. Yes.
Yeah. So I was just wondering whether that's something which you're going to follow up on, or with collaboration or something like that, or because you have so much of data.
You know, we definitely would want to. This is something that we've been noticing for the last 2 or 3 years. And I think, well, the numbers are definitely a jump because it was 0 earlier. And we see birds out in the wild that do have these lesions, and we catch them sometimes. I actually have a photograph of avian pox. But we've not yet taken any tissue samples.
Probably still very low frequency.
Overall prevalence is still low.
Yeah. Yeah. But it would be really interesting, especially if, so it may not, I don't know, it may not affect survival, but it would be interesting to...
The lesions are mostly around the eyes.
Okay, so it might.
Because the mosquitoes are biting them in that eye ring. The rest of the bird, pretty much mosquitoes can't end up biting because of feathers. So, you know, completely one eye completely covered with tissue, the eye completely replaced with scar tissue. So I think it would be affecting survival, foraging.
Great.
Sorry. Do we have any evidence that avian pox is caused by mosquito? It's apart from mosquito mites, or
Yes.
It's only
avian pox is transmitted by mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes we have. It's not mites.
No, mosquitoes. Pox and malaria in Hawaii. You know, actually, when we catch these birds and we look through these feathers, we started thinking of actually quantifying parasite loads. You know, how many feather lice are there, or how many mites are there. Surprisingly, very few birds have ectoparasites. If you see a bird with ectoparasites on it, you're like, oh, look at that, feather lice. Yes.
Are you planning to do surveillance for influenza?
Surveillance for diseases?
Influenza.
It's not allowed.
For influenza?
Influenza, avian influenza. But is it likely that the birds there will have avian influenza?
So forest birds generally don't. It's water birds that are more likely to be infected by influenza. That is the next big pandemic. That's going to hit hard. It's going to be way worse than COVID if it jumps. H5N1.
It has jumped.
It has jumped
there
to
was
humans.
a recent case, no? In the US.
In human.
Yes, yes, yes.
But not human to human transmission yet.
Not yet, not yet. No, but birds to humans.
Birds to humans and livestock.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant if people to people transmission becomes a reality. So far, that's not happened.
So the avian pox you are saying is also affecting the foraging for these birds, right? It will affect the foraging for
very likely.
these.
Very likely.
So have you seen this now?
We've not made observations
Then
on
survival
foraging.
rates, it will decline, right?
Yeah, we don't have data on that. The other thing about avian pox is that there are two forms. There is a cutaneous form and there is a form that affects the mucosa. So you'll have lesions in the mouth and mucosal lining of organs, which we cannot tell just by looking at a bird. So there might be, the prevalence of pox might be much higher than what we are estimating it to be. But I mean, if the eye is gone, and you've got only one eye, then I'm sure it's affecting things like foraging and.
Ashwin.
So two things. One is the ectoparasite load you said. Is it some species have more ectoparasites than the other?
Some species have?
The feather lice.
More influenced.
Ectoparasites. I mean
no, just the prevalence of ectoparasites is so low that we can't quantify anything in terms of differences between species.
Because in Western
generally
Ghats,
true for, is it generally true for more temperate
I
environments?
don't know.
Because in Western Ghats, a lot of birds have feather lice.
Really?
Yeah, full of them.
Dirty
wings.
Dirty
And
birds.
second thing was, you said there is a plateauing effect, right? And the geologically, in the Himalayas, after 1800, it plateaus.
Shape of mountain?
Yeah, it's plateauing, right?
It sort of becomes less steep at
Right.
mid elevations.
Could it be, I mean, is that the reason why birds are able to shift up? I mean, because it's easy, and instead of a very steep slope, if you have a plateau. I mean, even in Western Ghats, we see a lot of mid-elevation birds suddenly popping up. And if it's a gentle slope, that's where we see them on the edge more. It's a very, very vague observation, but I wonder if you notice something like that.
Not that I can think of.
But what might be interesting is to do something like a connectivity analysis to look at how easy is it for certain species to get to where they should be, based on the actual topography, and that would be really interesting, because then a index of climate susceptibility or something like that, I don't know.
Right. So there is a fair body of work that's been done. It's called climate connectivity, and a lot of work that's been done on looking at latitudinal range shifts and asking whether a species that is found here today, can it move to a location that has the same temperature or is cooler, 20 years from now? Is there a possibility that the species can end up in that new place at all or not? Because forest is so fragmented, there's no connectivity and so on. Turns out that the only parts of the world, of the tropics, that actually have some degree of climate connectivity is in the Amazon. The tropical Africa, Southeast Asia is even worse. The degree to which forests are fragmented in South and Southeast Asia, climate connectivity in the future is very, very poor for.
But Amazon forests are also kind of converting to grasslands. That shift is also we are seeing in Amazons and grasslands. So that is even worse.
Yes. Yeah. The Amazon is going to tip. It's already become a net source of carbon instead of a net sink. Net source of carbon instead of a sink. And sometime around, a lot of predictions say by 2035 or so, the ecosystem will shift its state from being a forest to becoming a savanna. And if that happens, God help us, because the amount of carbon that's in the Amazon is huge. And if that carbon is suddenly released in one go, then things are going to get bad very, very soon. So the thing is with climate change is that you've got all these predictable impacts that climate change has, right? You've got gradual rise in temperature. But with the gradual rise in temperature, the frequency and severity of extreme events becomes much higher. So there's so much energy now in Earth that is not leaving the system, that energy has to find a way to dissipate, right? And that's why we're seeing more cyclones and extreme rainfall events. And those have the potential to be even more damaging. So ecosystems tipping, those have the potential to be far more damaging than these slow, if you think of a bird population like the Bougainvillea chikla, 2 square kilometers, 20 individuals, one extreme event, and the population might fall to below any viable population size. And that's it for the species. We've already lost species to climate change. We've already lost species to fragmentation. In fact, the rate at which species are being lost right now is estimates, the reliable estimates that is 1,000 times the baseline extinction rate, which makes this a mass extinction. So this is the 6th ever mass extinction. And we're living through a mass extinction. Yeah. On that happy note. Thank you. Thank you.